Good morning and Assalamu alaikum. I'm now 72 years old, and there are not many good things about getting older, but one of them is that it gives you a sense of perspective, and more than anything else, that's what I want to share with you today. This is me. I've lived in Manchester basically all my life apart from the first 2 years. I grew up in a family where my parents couldn't read or write. I lived in the slums, as you'll see, and I went from there to Cambridge. And 13 years ago, I retired from my career as a chartered accountant and tax advisor. And on here in red is the address of my website. In retirement, I taught myself how to build a website, and my detailed life story is there, plus lots of talks and writings. And if the technology works, the recording of today's presentation will also end up on the website. And the slides, if you want them quicker than that, if you ask Miss Davies for them, she's welcome to give you the slides. As I said, Manchester is my home. The blue oval is where we are right now. Number 1 is where I grew up in the 1950s. That's now underneath Manchester University, as Manchester University has expanded. Number 2 is in Moss Side, very close to where the brewery is. That's where I lived in the 1960s. Number 3 in Longsight, the house is still there. The other house number 1 and house number 2 were demolished long ago. But number 3 in Longsight is still there. That's where I lived in the 1970s. And now I live in Whalley Range. And to get here today, 3 miles, I actually drove past the Victoria Baths on Halshead Road. And that's where I learned to swim. So you don't get any more local than that. This is what I'm going to talk about. The first thing is a reminder about how we, all of us as individuals, think about history. I've got some numbers about how Britain has changed, but then I want to talk about what the numbers mean and how the UK thinks about itself as a country, because that's the most difficult thing to grasp, but in some ways it's the most important. And then in the question and answer session, you can ask me about today's talk or about anything else you want to ask me about. So the first thing is the difference between your own life and history. And when I was at school as a teenager, I couldn't understand why the teachers kept talking so much about the Second World War and what they'd done in the war. And it's only as I got older, I really understood what it meant that the war then was only 20 years ago. Because to me, 20 years as a teenager was more than my life. The war, for me, the difference between World War II and the fall of Rome is a matter of detail. Obviously, you know, one is not very long ago, the other one was 2,000 years ago, but in both cases, they're history. And the same applies to you. You'll hear adults talking about 9/11 like it was yesterday. To you, it's a piece of history. But conversely, you've lived through history. People will be talking about the coronavirus pandemic for decades to come. And it's an integral part of your lives, and it's affected you so much. And that's something I only started to understand as I got older, when I realized, for example, that the Falklands War was longer ago now, and this is when I had the thought, than the World War II was. So I've promised to look at some numbers and some measurable things about how Britain has changed. And I'm going to look at 7 sets of numbers. So let's start. Everybody, or almost everybody, is interested in money. In 1950, although this graph only starts at 1955, Britain was enormously poorer than it is today. Yes, in 1950, 55, it still had most of the British Empire, but although India had gone by then, it went in 1947. But having an empire ain't great if you're actually pretty poor. And at £10,000 a year, which was the average income in those days, that's not much. Compare that to a number that now is about 3 times as high. So per person, Britons today are 3 times better off, everybody, than they were when I was starting out in life. I still remember how wonderful it was to buy my first calculator. I spent £40 on it in 1974. It had 4 functions and 1 memory. I've still got it. I keep it as a souvenir, although I've never used it. I haven't touched it for years, and I have to search the house to find it, but I know I've got it. In today's money, that calculator would cost just under £500. £40 1974 is worth about £500 now. But of course, nobody buys calculators anymore. And the impact of technology change on our lives is so massive. I wrote an article a few years ago, which you can find on my website, called Richer Than Pharaoh. And what I did was I compared myself with the richest man in the world about 4,000, 3,000 years ago, the Pharaoh of Egypt, Ramesses II. And I looked at what he could have that I didn't have, and what I've got that he didn't have. For example, he never watched a Shakespeare play, because Shakespeare hadn't written any plays at that stage. And in terms of the things that matter, you are incomparably better off than Ramesses II. No, you can't command any armies, and no, you haven't got any slaves, but actually you've got great dentistry, and he had nothing like that. If he had a toothache, he really suffered. Education levels. In 1950, only about 3.4% of the population went to university. Now it's over half. So if you look at 18-year-olds, by the age of 30, about half of them will have been to university. Even when I went to university in 1968, 69 is when I started, only about 7% went to university. And the act of going to university changes people in very fundamental ways, apart from them teaching them things. So the British population today is simply much better educated than it was before, and younger people, people in their 20s and 30s, are far better educated than people in their 70s and 80s. So when 80-year-olds vote for Brexit, most of them actually don't understand very much about what they're voting for, being blunt about it. Technology. I was always big into science fiction, and as a teenager I used to fantasize about having a keyboard, a computer terminal in my room connected to all the world's information. I just used to dream about it. It didn't exist. But every one of you now has got that. The phone in your pocket is more powerful than any of the world's computers around about 1960. What we know about biology. I mean, we had medicine, of course, in the 1950s. We had centuries of scientific advance, but we knew almost nothing. At that time, we didn't even know about the structure of DNA, because that was only identified in 1953 by some scientists who were actually connected with my college in Cambridge, Clare College. Sequencing the very first human genome cost $3 billion. Now it can be done for $600, and we have the ability to edit DNA, and we're still starting out at understanding what that will mean in terms of the ability to heal people. A couple of days ago on Radio 4 there was a story about a baby girl who's got a it would have been a life-ending disease. It's a genetic disease. Her sister's got it, and her sister will die of it. She's older and she's too old to be cured, but this 1-year-old has been treated with the most expensive single medical treatment in the country. The list price is about £3 million, although the NHS might have got it a bit cheaper than that. And this will change this girl's genome so that she won't die of her genetic disease. And that would have been utterly impossible even a decade ago. Television. My parents couldn't afford a telly for several years. I used to go and watch the television that our friends had. And I remember being so proud when we actually got our own television, and our television had 2 channels, because by then ITV had started. I still remember when BBC 2 started in 1964. Now everybody's television has thousands of channels, there's internet streaming, there's an endless amount of stuff that you can watch. It's just utterly transformed the scene, that you never need to watch a program when it's happening because you can always find it and catch up. Transformation of choice. Travel. In 1950, only about 1 million foreign holidays were taken, basically by rich people. In 2019, the last year before the pandemic, 93 million. Although the numbers for during the pandemic, of course, were lower, but they were recovering. And going abroad isn't just something nice, so you get better weather. It changes the way that you understand the world when you've actually been somewhere different. I know how much my understanding of Israel and Palestine changed on the 2 trips that I took to Israel and Palestine in 2009 and 2018. My own family came to the UK in 1952. My father had actually come originally earlier in 1931. After coming to the UK in 1952, I didn't go abroad until 1981, when I was aged 30. And the reason is quite simple. We were poor. I mean, since then I've travelled a great deal, but my children, I've got 4 of them, they are real globetrotters. They don't think anything about spending, a few years working in Japan, for example. My number 2 son lives in America at the moment. My older daughter lives in Switzerland. They just have a very different attitude to the world than I grew up, when the idea of going abroad was a really big thing. And it matters because Britons, especially Britons as opposed to continental Europeans, where you can go to another country just by driving a car over a border, the fact you have to cross even 22 miles of water to get across the English Channel has made Britons much more insular in their thinking. The word insular itself comes from the Roman word or Latin word for island. But the younger generation is quite different. The way that young people think about continental Europe is quite different from the way that the average 70 or 80-year-old thinks about continental Europe. Ethnic diversity. In the 1950s, I grew up in a country that was basically almost all white. The 2021 census has just been published, and as you can see, the country is still 81% white, but there's a big difference between 81% and 99.5%, or whatever the percentage was in the 1950s. And gradually the country will change. The white percentage will drop simply, if nothing else, by intermarriage. And again, that makes a fundamental difference to the way that we see ourselves, what it means to be British. For the first time, we have a Prime Minister who is not white, Rishi Sunak. Religious diversity. It's hard to find data about the past, but in the 1950s, when I was growing up, the country was overwhelmingly Christian, almost entirely Church of England. I mean, there was a sizable Catholic minority, but it's quite strange to think now, but Catholics were thought of as slightly strange, slightly peculiar. That's how different it was then. And the only meaningful non-Christian minority, even though there weren't very many of them, were Jews. Other religions were absolutely tiny. There were always a few Muslims, but very few. Look at it now. less than half the country says that they are Christians, and I suspect many of these are pretty nominal. I discovered that over 20 years ago when I was chatting with a client and discovered that she didn't even know that there was a book of Ruth in the Bible. But she was a Christian. 37% don't have a religious belief. The largest religious group apart from Christians now are Muslims at 6.5%. So again, fundamentally different. We have a Prime Minister who's not just not white, he's a practicing Hindu. We have a Home Secretary who is a practicing Buddhist. So those are the numbers I've just run through very quickly, but what do they mean? This is a map of the world between the wars, and I've coloured red the British Empire. It's a shame the Americans got away, because if we still had the USA, of course, it would have been even bigger. But even with that map, this was not just big, this was the biggest empire the world has ever seen. Much bigger than the Roman Empire, much bigger than the Chinese Empire, much bigger than the Muslim Arab Empire. The largest empire the world has ever seen, about 1/4 of the area of the world and about 1/4 of the world's people. Absolutely the biggest. And Britain was the very first country to industrialize. But look at Britain today. It's still important. It's a nuclear weapons state, and there still aren't that many nuclear weapons states. It's a permanent member of the Security Council. It's got a lot of soft power, in other words, influence in the world, although a lot less than it had 10 years ago, thanks to things like Brexit. And it's the 6th largest economy in the world, after America, China, Japan, Germany, and after India. Remember, India, a place which the British ruled. In terms of population, it is 21st. So that number 6 ranking is going to decline as the years go by. And more the world is dominated by other countries. And psychologically, it is really hard when you've been top dog coping with the fact that you're not. That's something the USA is starting to struggle with. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990, the USA was basically in a unipolar world. It had the USA and it just dominated everything, and it's struggling to come to grips with the growth of China. And it's got 100 years of psychological change to think about, the same with the UK has. Many people in the UK, especially again older people, still struggle with the idea that the UK is nothing like as important as it used to be. So stepping back again, looking at the hard facts, on the one hand, Britons are far better educated, they know the world much better, they're much richer, they're healthier, they live longer, and they're more diverse. The country looks more like the rest of the world, but it no longer rules the world. Britannia does not rule the waves. So that's all I wanted to say about how Britain has changed, but obviously we can take questions about that or anything else.